Welcome back to part 2 of How in the World Did We Come Into This World? Now, regarding the nature of man, the nature of Christ, in other words, the nature of humanity as to how one has actually come into the world, born. What nature did they take? From whom did they take that nature from? We are going to explore that concept today as we talk about the issues that surround the idea of the nature of man and the nature of Christ, so that we can begin with some hopeful thoughts for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh. God sent in His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Now, addressing this idea of the nature of Christ, we see right away that Jesus Christ, the remedy, the propitiation for our sin, the living Son of God, the infinite God of glory, He wraps Himself in flesh and becomes finite man. In other words, Jesus Christ now comes to earth to tabernacle with man, with all of humanity. And by doing this, He identifies and associates Himself with all of humanity. Now understand, when Jesus comes, and I'll just refer you to the Sanctuary of Strength, that series will help also understanding what we're getting ready to discover here. We know that everything in the sanctuary represents Christ Jesus. We must come to rightly understand that everything we study from the sanctuary is a clear view, a clear perspective, and a clear understanding of who Jesus Christ is. With everything in the sanctuary pointing to Christ, we must rightly understand, we must rightly apply the message of the sanctuary, otherwise we'll misinterpret and misapply who Jesus is. The result of misunderstanding the message of the sanctuary, which is so vital and critical to understand, is to misinterpret and misapply the entire plan of redemption. Now, you have to understand, as soon as the Lord, through Jesus Christ, created our world and placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Satan announced his purpose to conform to his own nature, the father and mother of all humanity, and to unite them with his own ranks of rebellion. Now, with that understanding, with that in mind, let us rush to an address to the nature of Christ as to how Jesus came in the flesh, God with us. Now, how was it when Jesus came in the flesh? What human nature did Christ assume at birth throughout His entire earthly life? Jesus had to assume some nature at birth, so the topic today is all about what nature Jesus assumed at birth and had throughout His entire earthly life. Now, as we address the nature of Christ, we are not addressing His divinity at all. We accept and we understand, biblically speaking, and throughout just about all of Christendom, we all have understood that Jesus is 100% God and 100% divine. He is wholly other. The nature of Christ issue only addresses the humanity part of Christ. We never address what portion of His divinity Jesus Christ is, because it is understood Jesus Christ is 100% God, and He is 100% God all the time while He is in the flesh, period. So that is not a part of the discussion today. Now, with that in mind, there are 3 basic schools of thought that we must concern ourselves with today. We are going to break down and clarify each of those schools of thought so that you'll be able to make an intelligent decision for yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe each and every position so that you'll be able to have the necessary tools to make a decision personally, to give you a platform to build upon, a foundation to address the issue rightly. Now, we're going to look at an address of the idea or the word prelapsarian, or the prelapsarian school of thoughts. We're going to give you 3 thoughts. Now, the word prelapsarian, pre means before, lapse means a fall, and Syrian is a suffix, making it a noun. As we look at the nature of Christ as it relates to these 3 schools of thought, prelapsarian school of thought, the first position that we're going to look at postulates and assumes that Christ in this human form took a sinless nature at birth. That is, He took or assumes the unfallen sinless nature of Adam before the fall. So Jesus took the nature of Adam before the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden. That is what is meant when we mention the word prelapsarian. That's what it means. Now, looking at the second school of thought, called the post-lapsarian school of thought, intimates and clearly teaches the position that Jesus Christ at birth, in human form or human nature, took on Adam's nature after the fall in the garden throughout his entire human life. Now, notice the difference between the pre and the post. Now, notice with me the prelapsarian Adam, represented by the inner and outer circle colored white, indicating that Adam had not yielded to any temptation. He was living in the pristine environment of Eden. Looking at the contrast of the post-lapsarian Adam after the fall, this is where Adam has yielded to temptation. He's yielded to sin through a decision that he had made to not comply with the commandments of God, but deciding that his way is better than God's way. And so there is a way that seems right unto a man, but its end is the way of death. And that death is indicated by the black inner circle, which represents sin. The outer circle, represented by green, these both represent being infected and affected by sin. And so we see there the difference between the two is one is clean, unyielding to sin. The other shows the yielding to sin, and the result is that Adam, the post-lapsarian Adam, is infected and affected by sin at this point. Now, looking at the three schools of thought, the pre, the post, and the mixture of both, what if you were placed in a position where you had to make a decision as to which one you would cast your lot on? Be it the pre, the post, or the mixture. Well, understand, if you said, well, I'm not really sure, but I'll go and cast my lot on the prelapsarian Adam, then understand what you're saying. What you're saying is that you've embraced the prelapsarian school of thought, which endorses the idea that when Jesus was born, he took the nature of Adam before the fall, the sinless nature. Now, let's just say that you've decided to cast your lot on the post-lapsarian Adam. Well, if that's the case, then what you're saying is that you've embraced the post-lapsarian school of thought, which intimates that Jesus took the nature of Adam after the fall, the sinful nature. Well, let's say that makes more sense to go with the amalgamation school of thought. If you choose the combination of the two, a mixture of half prelapsarian and half post-lapsarian, that means that you've embraced the amalgamation school. Understand, only one could be right. Either the pre, the post, or the amalgamation school of thought. A question must be asked at this point. Ask the question to yourself, are we born infected or affected by sin? This is a question we have to unpack and clarify exactly what we mean when we're talking about infected and affected. These are two medical terms that I borrowed from the medical realm. We are going to explain what these terms mean medically, and then we're going to employ these terms in a theological context. Now, medically speaking, once one becomes infected, let's just say with a COVID virus. Once your body becomes infected by that virus, COVID, then you begin to experience the effects that are the result from the infection, and the effects we call symptoms. So we all know what some of the effects are. And so once you become infected, then we see that there follows effects as a result of that virus. Now, theologically speaking, in that context, as we look at infection, the infection would be sin, and as a result of being infected by the virus of sin, what would be some of the effects as a result of being infected by sin? Well, the Bible's very clear. We have many, many effects as a result of sin as we come into this world. And we see Jesus there sweating great droplets of blood in the garden, where he experiences much, much pain as a result of sin. In fact, sin brought death, and we saw that Jesus experienced death, as we all do. And so death in these other elements of suffering are a direct result of nothing less than sin coming into the world, the effects of sin. Now, before we go any further, I need you to answer the question in your own mind right here and now. When we are we born infected or affected by sin? If you say that we are born infected by sin, then what you're saying is that we are born sinners. If we are born sinners, then sin is a condition and not a decision. We cannot say, based on the biblical definition of sin, that we are born sinners. We are not born sinners, but we are born sinful. And thus, having been born sinful, we are not born infected, but we are born affected. We are born affected by the decisions that our parents, Adam and Eve, the progenitor of the whole human race, affected by the decision they made. Adam and Eve became infected, and from their infection, not only were they infected, but the whole entire human race is now affected. So mankind, beyond the Garden of Eden, we are all born affected, not infected. So mankind, beyond the Garden of Eden, we are all born affected, not infected. You don't become infected until you choose to sin. For sin is the transgression of the law. The effect that all humans experience at birth is the effect of spiritual indigence. We have the effect of spiritual impotence. We are born spiritually weak without the power to overcome the tempter. That is the effect of sin. So you don't become infected until you do what Adam and Eve did in the garden. Until they chose to sin, then they became infected. So it is with you and me. Until you and me choose to sin, you are simply born affected by sin. So mankind beyond the Garden of Eden, we are all born affected, not infected. Now understand the effect that all humans experience at birth is the effect of spiritual indigence, and we have the effect of spiritual impotence. We are born spiritually weak without the power of the Holy Spirit to overcome the tempter, that is the effect of sin. This is done on your own accord, not for what Adam did in the garden. And all human beings will ultimately be overcome with the yielding to temptation. It's a foregone conclusion. Paul says, all of sin, which is a result of being affected. Now, having clarified infected over affected, I want you to make a decision as I share on these elements of being born infected, whether they are true or false. Well, if a man is born infected, true or false, man inherits guilt from Adam's sin. We also are born sinners for Adam's sin. True or false? Judged and convicted for Adam's sin. True or false? Condemned at birth for Adam's sin. Yes, if we were born infected, these would be true. But understand, these don't apply biblically to mankind and does not apply to you or to me. Now notice how mankind must be born affected as a result of Adam. True or false? If we're born affected, we inherited Adam's sinful nature. 2. Born into the world full of sin. 3. Born deprived physically and mentally. 4. Born with corrupt bodies, sickness, and death. Does apply to mankind and to you and to me. Paul says the wages of sin is death. Now, we are going to move into a focus of explaining your options, prelapsarian, postlapsarian, and the amalgamation school of thought. Now, I'm going to explain what amalgamation is and how it works. Okay, we have the prelapsarian Adam. If we notice there, the prelapsarian Adam is both innocent inside and outside. In other words, he's not infected or affected. Now, looking at the postlapsarian Adam, we see that he is both infected and affected as a result of the fall. Now, the prelapsarian Adam, we see there that he is created by God, and then the fall happens, and then Adam, after sin, after yielding to sin, is now addressed as a transgressor. Now, looking at the nature of Christ, the third option. We identify that Christ, this option identifies that Christ took a little bit from pre and a little bit from post. And so the nature of Christ, the inside, he would have to take that side, the innocent side, from the prelapsarian Adam, because the prelapsarian Adam was not infected or affected. And so Jesus had to take from the prelapsarian Adam the innocence or the sinless nature, not yielding to sin or temptation. Now, when we look at the nature of Christ on the outside, we see that the outside of the circle is green, which identifies that Jesus, when he came into the world, he came into a world with effects, and those effects without the world affected Christ. So we see that Jesus could not take that from the prelapsarian Adam because the prelapsarian Adam was living in pristine innocence. He was not infected or affected by sin. But after Adam had fallen, after he had yielded to temptation, now we see the post-lapsarian Adam. He's both infected and affected by sin. And so the nature of Christ would have to take that side of his nature from the post-lapsarian Adam. In other words, Jesus was affected by sin as the post-lapsarian Adam was. You're going to want to join us in part 3 of the nature of Christ to really get a grasp of why the amalgamation is an error. Even though it is the most logical understanding of how Christ came into the world, where he was born, never yielding to temptation, and yet he was affected by sin. So there's something wrong with this comparative analysis, and that's exactly what we're going to show you. So join us next time. We'll see you on the other side of this presentation.